claim that exposure to low-level radiation does not pose a risk to health is a myth generated by governments and the nuclear industry. During the nuclear arms race of the Cold War, scientific findings on health risks from nuclear fallout that contradicted the official narrative were censored. Scientists with integrity were discredited, punished, or blacklisted. In 1994, the United States Advisory Commission on Human Radiation Experimentation concluded that the literature on radiation and health during the Cold War was heavily sanitized and scripted to reassure and pacify public protests. Decades of official censorship reinforced the false core message, which was: human beings have evolved in a world where background radiation is present and is natural, and that any adverse health effects of radiation exposure is the occasional and accidental result of high levels of exposure. This is double speak. There are other sources of conclusive data that allow a very different interpretation of the health hazards posed by a nuclear disaster, such as several declassified records of the United States and the Soviet Union in its human radiation experiments, and many others. From these records, some important facts have emerged. For example, nuclear fallout and radioactive contamination of oceans and land ultimately enter the food chain and the human body, and therefore represent significant health risks. Chronic exposure to radiation does more than increase the risk of cancers. It threatens immune systems, exacerbates pre-existing conditions, affects fertility, increases the rate of birth defects, and can retard physical and mental development. Japan's ongoing nuclear crisis demonstrates the degree to which the state prioritizes security interests over the fundamental rights of people and their environment. Similar to other government responses to catastrophic events, such as Chernobyl and Katrina, Japan's response to Fukushima has been to control the content and flow of information to prevent panic and the inevitable loss of trust in the government, reduce legal liability, and protect nuclear and other industry agendas. Now, how do you think the Malaysian government would respond to a similar crisis here? Do you remember the response of the Malaysian government when Indonesian peat fires produced a smog in this country? Newspapers were not allowed to publish the levels of pollution because it would put away tourists. There are many lessons to be learned, not least of which is how to respond, adjust and adapt to dangers and health risks associated with life in a nuclear world. There must be strong public demand for transparency and accountability, two very rare commodities in this country. And that is a government that truly believes in and genuinely secures the fundamental rights of its citizens and the rule of just law. Have no doubts. Nuclear energy is not cheap, it is not clean, it is not safe. The Malaysian government has other ideas. Just take the problem of nuclear waste, which remains radioactive for thousands of years. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. Just think about that for a minute. A half-life of 24,000 years. You're really talking about radioactivity and radiation forever. So, how does nuclear energy come up as a safe, cheap, clean form of energy? If medieval man had used nuclear energy, today we would still be burdened with managing his nuclear waste. Just think of that. Surely this is not a legacy we should be leaving future generations. Yet vested interests in the nuclear industry are attempting to override common sense and reason. Nuclear power plants, like nuclear weapons, do not forgive mistakes of judgment, simple human negligence, mechanical error, or human error. Despite dire warnings, some governments continue to advocate and build nuclear power plants on the incredible argument that no mistakes will be made. The nuclear industry has a history of making misleading claims about nuclear safety that have often confused the issue and diverted attention from real solutions to the nuclear problem. Genuine debate and critical examination have been avoided, evidence ignored, opponents silenced or marginalized, and critical issues of public health and welfare have been answered with standard, bland platitudes. Now, what about the geological background to this whole question? Malaysia has so far not been traumatized by earthquakes or tsunamis, although situated close to earthquake-prone Indonesia and Philippines. But geological knowledge is incomplete and imperfect, and we rely on such knowledge too heavily when making policy decisions about locating hazardous technologies such as nuclear power plants. Nuclear facilities need geologically stable and physically secure environments in which to operate. Nuclear reactors are built to withstand what is termed in nuclear jargon as design basis accidents. Let's say accidents caused by reactor designs. Now, what happened at Fukushima is a beyond design basis accident. The nuclear industry bases its design basis accidents on what they call credible events, which are determined by an analysis of probables. The Fukushima disaster happened because they got their analysis wrong, in part because the credible event, or the event that was reasonably expected to occur, was thought to be an earthquake of magnitude 7.9 at most, and a tsunami of 6.7 meters at most. Not an earthquake of 8.9 magnitude or a tsunami 10 meters high. But geologists, like all human beings, sometimes get it wrong. Even politicians do that, don't they? Because they cannot always be accurate with their predictions. For instance, the Christchurch earthquake, and this is very interesting, the Christchurch earthquake of 6.3 magnitude occurred on an unknown and unexposed geological fault. In the minds of the experts, this fault never existed till the earthquake happened in Christchurch. In fact, unknown faults that cause damaging earthquakes are fairly common. So if a nuclear reactor's safety margin is based on specific predictions of geological phenomena, then there is a problem because geologists are not always correct in their assessments. In addition, there are a number of geological processes that come into Donald Rumsfeld's category of unknown unknowns. Geologists, and therefore the nuclear industry, don't know what these geological processes are, and therefore cannot make accurate predictions about so-called credible events. In other words, it's very much a guessing game. Perhaps intelligent guessing, but nevertheless guessing. In Fukushima, the question is whether building nuclear reactors in unstable areas was worth the risk or not. At the very least, it appears that they have lost 3 reactors, perhaps 4, or maybe all 6. Countries that are considering acquiring nuclear power need to soberly address and assess their plans, especially if they are located in active volcanic regions. Nuclear power requires stability, geological stability, and political stability. A political stable country or a political unstable country carries the risk of nuclear terrorism. So in conclusion, the Malaysian government has approached the crucially important issue of nuclear energy in its customary authoritarian manner. It smacks of an arrogant, corrupt government that has been in power for too long. Going to the polls periodically when there is no free press or freedom of expression or freedom of assembly cannot be equated with genuine democracy. In the same way, funding vested interests in the local nuclear industry to disseminate misinformation about nuclear energy to captive audiences cannot be equated with public education about one of the most dangerous forms of energy. Everything is being done to persuade the public that nuclear energy is good for the economy, the climate, and the country. But Malaysians must insist on their democratic right to an honest, comprehensive national debate and a national referendum on nuclear energy with independent oversight. I therefore call on the Malaysian public to form a people's coalition to mount a national campaign against the introduction of nuclear energy in Malaysia. Thank you.